the community lecture series. For tonight we have, as you know, Professor Jim Birchfield, who's going to talk to us about global free riders, environmental services, and the common good. First I have to ask you, as always, to turn off your cell phones. Then I have to say congratulations for coming in on such a wonderful evening. We should have just gathered outside or somewhere, Jim, that could have been it. We do have the wine and cheese party after the lecture is over. If you just go down the hall to 3:30, I think it's in those 3 rooms all together, so we'll have a chance to chat with each other. We don't yet have the schedules for the entirety of the MCAT programming, but we're going to get copies of them together for you as you leave, the schedules that we have, and the rest of them will be posted on the Alumni Association website. So you should be able to find those. I believe also, if you want to make sure that we have your contact information, is it okay if they still stop and talk to you, Susan, afterward? We seem to have mailing addresses or email for most people, but if you think we don't have that and you want us to send you a schedule, a full schedule, just stop and make sure that Susan has that information at the end. Okay? Good. It's great to see everybody here. Jim told me kind of an odd story about himself. I knew that we were really fortunate to have him here. I'm not making this up. I knew that we were really fortunate to have him here. I didn't realize quite how fortunate until he told me that when he was a young man, when he was a young boy, he really admired the Edgar Rice Burroughs books, and that he really thought he wanted to be John Carter, I believe, and in the movies now. So he could have been in the movies instead of here. But here he is, and go off to Mars. So I said to Jim, well, I'm glad that didn't work out for you. You know, I think Melissa's probably glad too, aren't you? Just all in all. So we're very glad to have him here. Again, I think this is a wonderful conclusion to our lecture. As you know, Jim is the Dean of the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the university. He's been Associate Dean of the college before and was Interim Dean before he was chosen to be the full-time Dean, and I think he's done a wonderful job over there. His program is really, really important to us here, and his speech tonight is going to be really important to the rounding out of our series. So, Jim, would you like to come up and get started, and then we'll have question and answer afterwards.
Thank you very much, Linda, for that nice introduction, and thank you, all of you, for coming tonight. It is a lovely evening, and I know that I'm also standing between you and the wine and cheese, and so I have my watch. I will make sure I do not go over time. And also, I really want to acknowledge my colleagues who spoke before me. The previous 5 speakers were all extraordinary: Dane Scott and Rebecca Bendix, Dick Barrett, Daisy Rooks, and Neva Hassanen, all provided, I think, a really wonderful framing of this idea of social justice on a global scale. It's, to me, a great honor to be included in a constellation of such bright stars. So thank you for having me. What I want to do tonight is I really want to talk about the idea of the environment and our relationship in the environment. We're kind of not apart from the environment, but we're embedded in it. And how do we, in our norms for justice and our norms for fairness and our ideas about appropriate behavior, fit in with the rhythms of this planet? And I thought it'd be nice. I was inspired by Neva to have a nice picture at the beginning so people could look at something when they came in. And indeed, I'm glad to be here on Earth instead of, you know, adventuring in Mars, although I thought I was going to be a hero just like in the movies, and ended up actually in a much better place to be here in Montana. The one thing I was really happy about this particular photograph of Earth is that it shows the moon as well. And I did want to be an astronaut. My first year in school, I was in aerospace engineering. I just thought that would be exciting. And I was fascinated that the British documentary In the Shadow of the Moon of about 5 years ago interviewed all the surviving astronauts who had actually walked on the moon. With the exception of Neil Armstrong, he did not agree. But all of those astronauts talked about their experience in one way, and that was they were fascinated by the Earth. It wasn't the moon that was interesting to them. It was looking at this orb in space. And they all commented on its fragility. This big blackness around it. And this was all we had. And I was really struck by that as this kind of sense of home once you are away from it. And, you know, notwithstanding the interests of Speaker Gingrich to go to the moon, I think most of us want to stay here. Although if he did go there, maybe he would have something finally to say when he came back. Now, I also want to tell you that I have mainly photographs. There are a series of photographs with some words, and this next one is kind of the introduction to the talk and what I'm going to say. But most of the time, there's going to be photographs of my experiences in other places. A lot of photographs are going to be from my time as a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala, because it was in the tropics, and I was really confronted by the issues of social justice and the relationship to people and the environment while I was there. And I had these scanned just recently, and so they're not as high a quality as perhaps some photographs, but they have, I think, a lot of meaning, and many of them are actually quite nice to look at. And so I pledge to you that while you're staring at these nice pictures, I'll mistakenly interpret your rapt attention as, oh man, I must be really interesting. But I'm going to talk about 5 different things. I want to talk a little bit about an ethical framework, and I'm going to use this idea of distributional justice, but over time, in terms of intergenerational equity, what we call sustainability. That, in fact, our relationship to this planet has something to do with time, to our children and to our descendants. After all, we have evolved on this planet to be who we are, and we have a responsibility to kind of allow and nurture that evolution to continue. I want to talk about environmental services, this idea of how ecosystems provide things for which we don't pay, for which we just accept for granted. And it's an issue that needs to be addressed. Finally, then, I'm going to go into the forest, because this is something I know a little bit about. And the major environmental services I'm going to talk about are related to forests and to biodiversity. And then the role of property as kind of a minor little sidebar as to how we can start to think about protecting environmental services in a modern way. And then, of course, the theme of this event is social justice in hard times, and I want to talk about hope in hard times, which is the kind of the byline of this whole series. And it's an honor to be able to close it and to be able to remind us that we really do have many things to be hopeful for. And finally, I'm operating under this assumption of interdependence, that human health and its productivity and well-being really depend on healthy ecological systems. Now, one thing that this presentation is not is very historical. I am unfortunately unable to go over the long history of our relationship to the environment, and even though it's going to seem like I'm critical of the human interaction with environmental systems, indeed, the advantages that we have gained from science and economic growth and capital formation have really benefited almost all of us. We live very comfortable lives here. We have done a lot around medicine and education and the ability for each other to be able to survive longer than in the past. And so don't let me discount what has happened in the past as being all bad. It certainly is not. But we also have a very odd economic relationship with the planet, one that is often characterized by short-term exploitation. And this is actually a photograph of the United Fruit Company officers in Guatemala in the 1920s. Probably one of the most egregious companies that has, taken land away from people and, made money on bananas and then left nothing behind. So we have some things to answer for in our history, but unfortunately I'm not going to be able to draw enough of those comparisons, and I apologize for that. Now let me explain the title of my talk about global free riders and the common good. A free rider is someone who consumes a resource without paying for it. That, you're getting a benefit with no cost to you. Oh, thank you very much. And we worry about this in economic terms, and there's a lot that's written by this, and Dick Barrett in his wonderful presentation talked about this concept and about justice and distributional justice in economics, and the issue of equity and efficiency being kind of a paradox. But I want to state that, we're all free riders. We can't help being free riders. We're organisms. We're breathing air. We're consuming resources. We've got this beautiful green planet, and we're going to use it. It's not inherently bad to be a free rider, But we have to kind of consider the impacts of that, and is there a way that we can kind of nurture the future and that doesn't make it so that it's impossible for the future, because critical functions are dependent upon what we do now. And so this kind of thinking about time and equity is this idea of sustainability. And its most famous definition came from the Commission on Sustainable Development called the Brundtland Commission. And it was in 1987, Gro Brundtland was the Prime Minister of Norway and led the World Commission on Environment and Development and came up with this oft-quoted statement that development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's the ethical framework behind which I'm working when I'm talking about free riders and the common good. How can we ensure that future generations are able to meet their own needs? It is quite a challenge. And it's a challenge because the world gives us so much that we take for granted. It gives us many things that we've never been forced to pay for, and now suddenly the bill collectors are starting to show up at our door. The kinds of things that allows the ecosystems to function on both small and large scales are things that are just kind of out there for us. But they are real, and we can measure them. And we understand that things like climate regulation, that's affected by oceans and forests particularly, is very important to us. We see with climate change the impacts that can happen to cereal production, to rising sea levels, and things that can be very serious if we don't take care of the systems that allow for climate function in the atmosphere. Water regulation. I'm sorry there's so many things up here. I don't want to bore you with this list, but I'll leave it up here for a minute and tell you that I'm going to talk a little bit more about genetic resources because tropical forests are so important to genetic resources. They're the storehouse of much of the world's genetic history. It's kind of like the ultimate bank account of evolution. And to see tropical forests disappear is kind of like robbing from yourself and from your children. And I also want to talk a little bit about some of the things on the lower end of the scale, these cultural resources that allow us to have these sense of identity in ourselves, and even for human health. And lo and behold, as I was thinking about the presentation this morning, here in the Missoulian in this morning, here's Beth Schenk's article, The Nurse's Notes, about a human health being tied to environmental services. I thought, oh my gosh, how perfect. And I wrote down one sentence that she wrote that was quite lovely. It's becoming clear that ecosystem services themselves impact environmental health. From this perspective, it makes much more sense to consider the human health value of protecting planetary processes. It makes doing so acts of health promotion and disease prevention. So we benefit from this. We understand that by allowing these global processes to function, we ourselves are more healthy. And, here in Montana, it's awful easy to just kind of sense that this is the way it is everywhere. I mean, you go to Glacier National Park and there's this kind of amazing awe and gratitude for what we have here. And it's not just us. Everybody else who comes to Glacier Park or goes to these beautiful places sees what it means to appreciate the grandeur of the earth and the processes that make it function. It kind of makes being human a lot of fun. Even if you're in a place that doesn't have much nature, when you're taken out of those urban areas and put into nature, the appreciation is immediate. It's across all cultures. It's not as if this aesthetic is just based on those who live here or have a certain education. It's widespread. So we know that nature is providing us something very powerful. Now, I'm taking this from Charles Hall, an economist from SUNY at Syracuse. And he was here on campus a few years ago to talk about the economy of nature and how we don't actually pay the full value because we start at such a late time in the real production function of goods and services. Natural capital and processes from solar radiation and photosynthesis, evolution, genetic resources, all these things, the accumulation of nutrients, they take millennia. And we start valuing them as soon as we extract them. We don't really think about what it costs to replenish what made it possible. And then we use the sale and use of goods and, of course, the disposal and recycle. But if we start making that arrow thinner and thinner, if we start reducing the capacity of the Earth to regenerate itself and to allow those functions to go forward, our economy, our ability to provide goods and services is really diminished. And if it really disappears, then what do we do? What kind of life do we have? What kind of not only aesthetic, but what kind of capacity to feed ourselves and take care of our most basic needs? And I threw this little photograph of the car in there just as kind of an example of, wonder if you just, in the manufacture of a car, you didn't pay for the engineers who designed it and all the extraction and the labor to make it and everything else. You just paid the guy who stole it. You just paid the guy that said, hey, thanks for the car, and then started driving it around. Would we really have very many cars anymore? So this is kind of a metaphor for understanding how it is that we must start thinking about those things that allow us to be who and where we are. And now, in a globalized world, all this stuff is becoming more and more accessible to more people. And more people want to have a higher standard of living. Here's Port Alberni, Canada. Lots of forestry pictures here, so get ready. Moving chips overseas. And the idea of global products has been real for a while, and now, in this day and age, it's a very serious thing to be able to understand distribution systems worldwide. Because we're using plants from Asia, they're using wood from Montana now. We're importing our electronics from labor in China. All different kinds of transactions are going on, but there's only one basic resource, the planet, from which all of this comes. And so my talk is about how do we organize ourselves to deal with this? What kinds of things should we pay attention to so we can sustain this amazing production of goods that start way back and allow us to keep it going for our children? Now, we're starting off from a place that could be a lot better. This is my neighbor in Guatemala. And he was a young man who was quite industrious, and he recognized that, this silly gringo here has, not used the grass in his yard. I can't believe it. I had this little closed-in area, and, I didn't have a lawnmower, thank God. And so the grass grew, and he would come in and with his machete cut the grass because he could feed his horses next door. And it became really apparent to me how tied people are of limited means to the immediate production of resources. They don't have the capacity to think too much about years from now or the next generation. They need to be able to survive right now. And so I'm going to kind of go into a phase of this is the part of the talk that's not all that uplifting. So get ready for that. Thankfully the sun is shining outside, and if you want to take a little break, this might be a good time. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that our distribution hasn't been that effective. The systems that we've set up to address economic justice haven't really, as Dick Barrett and some of the other speakers have pointed out so well, haven't really met the needs of the majority. In fact, we've got 1 billion people right now living in poverty that is less than $1 a day's worth of income. 22,000 children die daily from poverty. These are enormous numbers. These came from the Hunger Project. And in addition, even those who try to work are in conditions that are really not amenable to them being able to break out of them. They're kind of stuck in this cycle of poverty. And even more difficult, and I can't sugarcoat this because I was in Guatemala during a time of tremendous civil tension. This is enforced. This is enforced with violence, that people are kept in these conditions and not allowed to be able to move forward. And this is one of the major challenges of our lifetime, not only dealing with Earth systems, but dealing with violence worldwide. And there's been violence towards the Earth. This is a high elevation Paramo in Ecuador. It's been completely denuded, overgrazed, and really turned into kind of almost a moonscape. So we've got serious environmental issues that we have to deal with because we haven't addressed those issues of distributional justice and how we use resources in a way that's not only fair, but a way that is regenerative and allows them to come back. And I borrowed this slide from Steve Running. It gets a little scarier. We're going to pull up, it's going to get better later on in the talk, so hang with me. This is that wonderful hockey stick diagram that I'm sure you've heard Steve talk and is really quite compelling, where it looks from, practically over 1,000 years and estimates what global temperatures were up till we started taking measurements about 1860. And then these are real measurements up to 2005. And then these, on the right, what this diagram is, are the projections of different models of what's going to happen to global climate. Now, I don't think I'm going to be able to use this without completely turning off the machine, so I'm going to point. The lower line there, the very lowest line, that kind of brown that shows kind of the temperature leveling off at about 2 degrees Celsius higher than now, is if we were behaving really great. If we were addressing global climate issues and dealing with carbon sequestration, lowering emissions, making sure that we're dealing with all the greenhouse gases, fluorocarbons, methane, et cetera. And, by 2100, we'd be in a little bit bad shape. We'd have some tough stuff of 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature is a lot of ice melting, sea level rise, but maybe tolerable. Unfortunately, instead of being there, we're to the left of the most pessimistic projections. Every time the IPCC meets, it recognizes we're doing far worse than our worst case scenario. We are almost on a vertical line of increasing our emissions and our global heat holding capacity. So we've got some serious work to do ahead of us if we're going to address the issue of global warming. I'm going to briefly dip into the stream just to talk about water, because we really can't say that every environmental service is the same. Water is a particularly important case, and especially the distribution of water. There was a wonderful book that was written just recently by Steve Solomon called Water, the Epic Struggle for Wealth, Power, and Civilization. And it's kind of a world history through the lens of the availability of water for the growth of food. And what he identified is that, like many resources, water is not evenly distributed. The successful societies have managed their water well. Those that have failed have almost universally failed because they did not manage their water systems well. This was the case, by the way, in Guatemala, where the Mayan population collapsed dramatically. And he makes this statement. A water history is everywhere a layered history. Ancient, medieval, and modern methods always coexist, yet crucially it is an unevenly layered history, imparting enormous and easily overlooked advantages to the comfortable water haves and crippling disadvantages, starting with a life handicapped by malnutrition, ill health, and sacrifice of education to the daily search for water to the world's poor. The need for water trumps every human principle, social bond, and ideology. It is literally indispensable. So the management of water systems, if we're going to solve one of the true challenges for social justice on the global scale, it's addressing the interests of water. And we have a lot of working to do. We have a lot of explaining to do, as Desi said to Lucy, about what it is that we do with our water. We don't have many water conservation incentives, particularly here in the West. And that's something we're going to have to think about a lot, especially as climate changes, and it's going to be changing. We also have the world's oceans that we have to pay attention to. And right now, the world's oceans are in a lot of trouble. We notice that the fish stocks are collapsing, and I'm going to get into property in a minute, because there is no one there to make appropriate claims or to be able to protect those claims on fish. We see that, about 10% of the fish stocks are already depleted and gone. About a third are on their way out. And, an oceanographer, Lisa Sottini, called fish the bison of the ocean. That we are just after them just like we went after the bison. So we're going to need to have a way to manage these systems on a global scale. Well, let me go into forests, because that's something, I feel a little more comfortable talking about. I enjoy forests. They're just magnificent things. Not only are trees beautiful, but what trees provide are marvelous to us. And I am a forester. And I also made a claim of being a tree hugger, which is true. The tropical forests are of particular interest, and the biodiversity that's there is also important. I've got to go one more slide because I really do want to be able to show this one picture that I think is pretty cool. I was once at a conference of foresters, and it will go unnamed. And the speaker before me stood up and said, "I can't believe we're having our kids read this Lorax book. I mean, what about this? This is just creating a whole bunch of people who hate, the timber industry. They want to shut us down." And, I had a young son at the time who, he just read stories to endlessly, and I had memorized the Lorax. And the opening lines are, "I am the Lorax, I speak for the trees. I speak for the trees have no tongues." And who shouldn't be speaking for the trees? As foresters, we need to speak for the trees. Now, I also like to cut them down, and I'll show you some pictures of that too. But the reality is the trees are providing us things that are truly extraordinary. This is a photograph of a tropical forest. These are special cases. 40% of the world's oxygen comes from the tropical forests. A quarter of modern medicines come from there. And of any biome in the world, they are under the greatest pressure. I'll show you some statistics in a minute that are a little bit scary, but I'll jump to the main conclusion. We lose tropical forests at the rate of 1 acre per second. About 22 million acres every year. That's a lot. And the big issue is the issue of biodiversity. This is the home of life. This is where terrestrial life lives. There's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million species. Most of these are arthropods. These are not species with backbones. They're insects. There's lots of other kinds of creatures that we don't see, but nevertheless have very significant functions in the ecosystems. And many of them are what are called endemic. They only live in small areas. Tropical forests often have been relatively stable climatically, so they've had this opportunity to evolve in place. And what we see is that 50 to 60% of all of these terrestrial species are located in the tropical forests. So once we lose them, they are gone. They don't come back. This is, as I mentioned, the big bank account, and the window is open and the money is blowing out that window. We see the extinction rates are perhaps 100 times background extinction rates, something like 1 vertebrate every 9 months and perhaps 50 species a day. We really have to focus on this particular biome if we want to be able to continue to have the opportunity not only to utilize these amazing genetic resources, but to allow them to evolve ahead and to see how they are going to adapt to a changing place, because that diversity is what gives us adaptation. Now, here's what's going on. As I mentioned, these are pretty spooky numbers. The net change, and these are in hectares, by the way. A hectare is about 2.5 acres. So you see, globally, we're losing about 9 million hectares a year, and of natural forest, about 12 million. And look, we're actually losing more in the tropical countries than the global total, because in the non-tropical countries like us, we're adding forest. We're actually planting trees. Plantations have been a big success. We are really kind of capable of being able to grow wood for ourselves. That's why forests are so wonderful, is that they are regenerative. We're able to allow them to come back. So, we've actually kind of buffered in a tiny way the loss of tropical forests, but we haven't buffered that loss of the genetic diversity. And often they're sold at very low prices for very high profits for those who are extracting them. Now, before I come too sanctimonious, this is me next to a big stack of redwoods. It's not as if it's, those people in the tropics, what are they doing? We did exactly the same thing. And one of the major waves of deforestation on the planet was here in North America. And, this is about 30 years ago, and I think this photograph proves unequivocally that I was never good looking. But I was also engaged in this, what the historian Paul Hurt called the conspiracy of optimism. This idea that we could manage those forests better than the natural forest. We could do, way better than nature. And I used to write, and this is one of my colleagues back when I worked for the Forest Service in about 1982 and on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, and we're clear-cutting big, old-growth Pacific silver fir and Douglas fir there in western Washington. And, I was responsible for writing the environmental assessments. And, you kind of knew something was wrong. And so we would play games with adjectives. But this was, the way that it was supposed to be. Foresters really thought, by golly, we're going to improve things. We're going to take this big old tree here, this decadent, decaying, dying, over-mature, unproductive, filthy, dirty, old growth, and turn it into young, vigorous, thrifty, economical, genetically improved young trees. And, well, that kind of contrast might work when you're comparing assistant to full professors, but not necessarily with trees. So I want to talk about the loss of forests on a large scale. What are the proximate or the direct causes, and what are the underlying causes? Because my argument is that we must address the underlying causes. And we know the proximate causes. They're well articulated. Industrial logging, fuel wood and charcoal. Agricultural clearing is, by the way, the largest. Subsistence farming, mainly cattle grazing. And then there's infrastructure and industrial development, which is happening in many of the forests, even in the temperate zone. And here you see this kind of classic picture of colonialization. There's the guy with his shorts. And these are dipterocarp forests in Malaysia, by the way. This was given to me by a Malaysian colleague several years ago. But then there's fuel wood gathering. That is an amazingly important activity for people because 3 billion people in the world get their energy from wood. They continue to use wood energy. Now, by the way, I like the idea of wood energy. It uses the carbon that's circulating in the ecosystem. But for most people, it's a tremendous effort. And many people are taking the last pieces of the forest to be able to provide food for cooking. Something like 92% of the wood in Southeast Asia is used for energy by local people. These are FAO statistics. And I actually had an opportunity to observe some of this when I was there. And then there's cattle grazing. These Nebu cattle that were imported from Asia are now all throughout the Americas. They're resistant to disease more than some other cattle, and they're actually able to survive. And we're clearing large areas for cattle production because, those of us who are wealthy like meat. And, here's some terrestrial resources to use it. Now, here's a couple of photographs I took one day when I was out as a Peace Corps volunteer in a cloud forest, one of the rarest of forests on the planet. In these highland tropical zones in the Andes, and in a few places in Africa, and in the Himalayas, you've got these amazing old-growth forests where it's wet and humid, very acidic conditions. You get large logs and decay. You get all kinds of interesting species, orchids and birds and things like that. And I took a photograph of that when I was working in these villages. And then about maybe 200 yards from this picture, it looked like this. And the reason it looked like this is that the person needed to grow food for his family. And we often look at this person who is acting very pragmatically as the enemy. Oh, this is the guy that's cutting down the forest. Well, indeed, this is the guy that's cutting down the forest. He's doing it with a machete, too, which is almost unbelievable. But at the same time, he's doing it because he has no choice. We would do the same thing. How is it that we can organize ourselves to make sure that we don't continue to make these mistakes? Well, first of all, we have to understand what are the underlying causes. Why is this person doing this? And of course, poverty is this driving reason. Market failures. We have not, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, we have not really allowed people to have the property rights to invest in their own land and to be able to sustain their own productivity and to ensure that they have a stake in a long-term future. And we've had terrible policy failures. subsidies and corruption for the extraction of resources that we see in minerals, that we see in forests, that we see in all kinds of natural resources sectors. In other words, there is no full cost accounting for what it really is to be able to reproduce these incredible resources. Now, I also want to take just one little brief detour and make sure we don't mistake a very ancient and actually very conservative agricultural system, slash and burn agriculture, sometimes called swidden agriculture, as a bad way to manage forests. Actually, this has been going on for thousands of years, where people remove a small portion of the forest. This is, by the way, in the central Amazon, and plant manioc or other kinds of starchy crops. They burn it immediately after harvest, releases the nutrients of the ash. They grow food for about 2 or 3 years. They'll move on to the next area of forest. And then after 20 years, they'll come back to the same area. The nutrient capital has been restored, and they can repeat the cycle over and over again. Now, with population at very high levels and with interest in marketizing some of the subsistence food, what has happened is that the fallow period has disappeared. People continuously crop, and so we start to see a drop in productivity. But as an ecological system, this is actually very sophisticated. All right, let me go into this issue of property rights as an idea to be able to address some of the ways that we can kind of deal with these underlying causes. How can we make sure that we have a responsibility to nature even among ourselves? This is Susan Hanna's work from her book, The Rights in Nature. And she laid out a nice kind of little matrix, a very simple matrix for looking at what she calls property regimes. This idea that different types of property have different obligations, and they also have different rights associated with them or different interests associated with them. Let me start at the bottom, because that's what we see, for example, in the oceans, where we really run into trouble, what Garrett Hardin has famously called the tragedy of the commons. We have open access, or non-property. That means everybody for themselves. And who is the owner? There isn't an owner. Just, it's out there for the taking, the classic free rider situation. And what are your owner interests or rights? Go get it. Capture it. This is what we've done with many of the world's fisheries. Let's just catch them and go after them. I mean, we used to only be interested in tuna and large-scale predator fish, and now we're going after, what's called the field mice of the oceans, the anchovies and the sardines and this much smaller fish. Open capture has really been bad news for the ocean stocks. And we saw that it was bad news here in Montana in the turn of the prior century when, grazing was just go get it, get the cows and the sheep out there and see what happens. The range was in terrible shape. It's in far better shape now than it was before because we finally figured out that we had to have some kind of stake. We had to have some ownership of the actual property. And you see this in tropical zones where people are really disempowered because they don't have secure tenure. When you start seeing secure tenure in land, you immediately start to see much higher benefits to resident populations for issues of food and health and education. So we also have this idea of moving up of state property, that all of us own things. And we have the great fortune here in Montana of having a lot of state property around us. State meaning either the state or the federal government, or even local governments. And we're the owners, the citizens. And the owner responsibility is for us to determine the rules. The problem with determining the rules is, boy, is that ever hard. You can't have a timber sale without, 2 years worth of teeth gnashing over is that the right idea. But the point is actually good. What it's demonstrating to us is that people are really paying attention and thinking about what are our social objectives. Should we be cutting these trees down or should we be leaving them for shade? Should we be putting a road here? Or maybe we better protect that area for bull trout. So this idea of state property is, I think, really clearly demonstrated that when people have a stake in the outcome, that the idea of property can be a very strong incentive for protecting Earth's resources, for protecting those functions. Now, in common property, it's a collective. And your interest is to exclude the non-owner. Oop, this is our little group here, and we're going to manage this. And yet you have to be able to maintain or constrain the rates of use. You can only have so much corn in your little Amish community, let's say, that's how much you're going to be able to produce. And the Amish have figured this out, and if their community gets too big, they split, kind of like a beehive swarms, and move to a new location so they can maintain their collective interests. And then, of course, we have private property, which is a really powerful idea, one that came about through the Enlightenment, and one that's given us all this opportunity for economic growth. And it's served us well, and the individuals have incentives to be able to gain something from their property. And they have the opportunity to be able to use this as long as it's socially acceptable. And they have an agreement, a social compact with the state to be able to protect their property interests. So someone doesn't come in and steal all your tomatoes, so that you can protect yourself from trespass, that the big landowner with the gun doesn't come and just drive you off like they might do that in Guatemala. But the issue is the avoidance of socially unacceptable uses. And here is where, in property in the United States and in many places in the West, we've set the bar very low. In other words, we have not asserted the public interest in private land. And many authors, like Eric Freefrogel, argue that, quote, landowner liberty should be recognized only when it promotes the common good. Now, I know that sounds pretty far out, but these kinds of statements were exactly what James Madison was talking about in the formation of the government, because the purpose of government, he says, is the protection of property. But it was the protection of property for the common good. And do we have examples of people who are thinking about the common good in the use of their property? And lo and behold, we do. And it's really amazing to recognize that a few recent events have made Montanans especially cognizant of the idea and the responsibility they have toward property ownership for the common good. Because many people now are very concerned about wildfire spreading across not only their property, but to the neighbor's property. And particularly of spreading from the neighbor's property to your property because of the damage that it might do. So people are recognizing that their own behaviors on their land actually affect ecological function, the behavior of fire. I have a graduate student, Jennifer Martinick, who's just finishing up her thesis. She interviewed a lot of people in the Seeley Lake area who were affected by the Jocko fire and have been affected by these programs to get people to thin forests so that they reduce the risk of fire. And here's what one of them said. I think if you live in the woods, you have a responsibility to yourself and everybody else to take care of your property, to make sure you don't put anybody else in danger. That's precisely the idea of raising the bar of ownership, responsibility, and property, that you don't want to create harm for someone else. Expanding the idea of the exchange for the protection of your property, you will do no harm to your neighbors. And we're seeing this in other areas. We're seeing things like setbacks and riparian areas to be able to protect all those ecological values that are occurring along a river. And those are important to us. So there is some way to use our institutions and the knowledge we have to actually raise this bar of ecological services to be something that we perceive as in not only our own benefit, but in everyone's benefit as well. And allowing kind of this transition from let's just use the earth and not pay for it to be able, we have to sustain this together. That is the challenge that we face. Finally, I want to show, before I move off of property, and I want to make sure I leave some time for questions. I'll be done in about 5 minutes here, so we should have some time for questions. I know you can't figure out what this is, but it's not a very good photograph, but it's so compelling. This is in a little village in Guatemala called Ixtupil. And right here in the bottom is an undiscernible kind of black blob. That's actually old black plastic bags that have been wound together with twine because the people were too poor to own a soccer ball. So their soccer ball was just a bunch of wadded up, tied together plastic. And the back edge of the picture is one of the largest coffee plantations in Guatemala called La Perla. And the owner was just he was lawless. He did whatever he wanted. He had his own police force. He was not really a very likable character. And he just kept gobbling up land. Since there were no institutions to protect property, he could just go get it. And so he kept expanding his coffee plantation. And so what the community did was, right at the edge of his latest acquisition, they built a soccer field. And they said, football fields are public property. You can't take this. And it stopped him. So it was like a remarkable kind of recognition of the power of organization to be able to address a property interest, even in very, very situations of limited means. Okay, I want to close with the close of what this series is really about. That even though we are in hard times, both economically, in terms of the environment, in terms of the distribution of wealth, there are things that allow us to have hope. Actually allow us to have a lot of hope. And I want to talk about three things. The idea of resilience. The fact that the earth knows how to take a punch. This is an amazing place that has been hit pretty hard in the past, and it has come back. And the second thing I want to talk about is this idea of small wins, the little things that count. And we heard Neva Hassanen's just tremendous presentation last week of some of the things that have been happening here in Missoula to control our food system, for community-supported agriculture and the other kinds of organizations that have been working. And I had to put this quote up here from Rachel Kaplan, who was one of the professors when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and she said something that I thought was enormously powerful. And that is, participation is the antidote to helplessness. And that's really been true in my life. If you're feeling like you're just not getting anywhere, it almost doesn't make any difference what you participate in. You are having an effect. And if you're feeling blue, go out there and do something. It does make a difference. And then finally, this idea of learning, why you're here tonight. That, in the face of these challenges, perhaps if we know more and are aware and are conscious of the tools that are available to us, we can make things better. Back to the idea of resilience. Here's a really degraded site in Ecuador. Not terribly far from that one photograph that looked like the moon that I showed. Absolutely eroded, abused, overgrazed, in very difficult shape. And not far from this, there's a plantation that's growing. And think about this. Here's an aspen grove. This is an early successional stage species that's native here to Montana, as well as the cottonwoods. 12,000 years ago, where we were standing, when the glacier recedes, there wasn't anything but rock. There was just a bunch of cobbles, and Rebecca can speak much more clearly about what goes on post-glaciation, but succession happens. Organisms, lichens, then fungi, then small bacteria, then all kinds of small plants. All of a sudden, in 12,000 years, boom, it looks great here. Wow, I didn't know there was a glacier here. The world can bounce back. We have the opportunity to be able to do that. And we can kind of foster that along. One of the things that I'm most proud of that's going on in the College of Forestry and Conservation is our wildland restoration program. And we've just revitalized our greenhouse, and we got a bunch of energetic students out there doing native plants. And it happens all over the world. In some of the most difficult and impoverished places, people are reclaiming the land themselves, and it actually works. There is an opportunity to make a difference by intervening and mimicking nature's processes. We're learning about new kinds of food and forestry systems, agroforestry systems. Here's a group of avocados, for example, and intercropping to allow us to provide needs for people immediately while also providing long-term needs for shade and pollination and the other ecological services that I was mentioning before. And some of these techniques are actually quite ancient. We're just rediscovering them and applying them into new places. This is also kind of hard to see. But this is a zapote tree that chicleros use for that native chicle, that sap that comes from tropical trees that used to be used for the base of gum. And here's a tree that's cut in front of it. This is actually a communally owned property in Quintana Roo, Mexico, where the ejidos there, the kind of the communal land ownership, has decided to do integrated forest management. I saw a guy there with a T-shirt that said, "Jose loves the trees." And he'd made it himself. It was just really remarkable. And I also want to talk a little bit about the use of wood. I've come off with the Lorax quotes and things like that, but wood is actually an incredibly important product. It provides a terrific set of economic opportunities, particularly for people in rural areas. We know, for example, that about 60 million people worldwide are employed directly in wood products industries, $100 billion a year. These are one of the few manufacturing jobs that's available in remote rural areas. And we've gotten better and better with technology to be able to use it. We have a wood products industry here in Montana still, thankfully. It's really taken a few tough punches in the recent economic downturn. We're down to about 126 wood products facilities now in the state. And in 2004, there were 215. We've lost a lot. This has been a hard time for the forest industry. But at the same time, it's still here. It's still intact, and there are still the capable people to make it happen, to allow us to manage the forest. And I want to support the forest industry and what we do to make opportunities not only for the labor and the work, but wood is this marvelous product. If we really want to sequester carbon and take it out of the atmosphere, trees are the most effective ways to do it. And as long as it stays in this beautiful product that's wood, this carbon that's locked up in this podium isn't going back into the air. It's right here. A real thoughtful strategy would be to build as much as we possibly can with wood and to let it stay there for a very long time, because that's a way that we can actually pull down atmospheric carbon. And talking about small wins, Melissa will recognize this picture. These are 4 Saraguran Indians in Ecuador who, on their own, decided to protect their own private property to be able to save the cloud forest there. They recognized that many of their neighboring communities had decided to cut it down, but they realized that they had better water than anybody else and that they wanted to sustain that. So they organized their own community to say, we are not cutting this forest down because we want to sustain our water system. Here's 4 environmental heroes, one of the rarest forests in the world, who are doing it because they recognize the significance of those environmental services. And another thing that I'm really proud of and was so happy to hear about the successful Global Leadership Initiative launched today, that the interaction with the rest of the world has been something that's taught us a lot. I've been very fortunate to work with forest managers and park managers from around the world for the last 15 years here. And when you get someone from Ghana talking with a park manager about common problems, you know that not only are you connected, but you have this opportunity to learn from one another, strategies that perhaps you might not have thought of, techniques that actually can work and they're common across boundaries. And those opportunities, not only for our managers and our faculty, but for our students, are truly extraordinary. And so, what we do is important, whether it's a teacher like this Guatemalan teacher who's doing basic literacy with the students, or what we do here at the university. This idea of learning is a powerful thing. It never goes away. We are transformed by the experience of learning. It creates in us not only hope, but capacity to deal with problems. And for everything we do, this is really the goal, isn't it? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to have a mic. Susan, do you also have a mic here? Oh, she does. Okay, good. So we'll do the usual routine thing. I'll stand over here. Susan, you over there. And who has a question? Put up your hand, and one of us will bring a mic. question?
Where's the wine and cheese?
Where's the wine and cheese? He has it in his pocket, really. Okay, hang on. Oh, no, you're going to be unpopular. Okay.
Your presentation seemed to me quite optimistic, and there are so many ways to look at this situation in a pessimistic way. And one, how do you maintain your optimism? And two, do you think that given population growth and all the problems that we can imagine, that really there is really cause for optimism?
That's a very good question. And it's not just a glass half empty, glass full kind of choice that we're making. No, I'm optimistic to answer the first part of your question because of them. They're optimistic. This is their world. They're ready to take over. I mean, I talk to my students and they're like, let me at it. I can do some of this. Let me try that. They're willing to accept the challenge. They want to believe that the world not only can be better, but it can be shaped by them. And that feeling of power that they have in themselves, allows them to try things that, we would like, whoa, try that, I don't think so. But it might be exactly the strategy that's going to work best now. And in terms of all these real things, I think we have to be aware of them. We can't be Pollyanna and say, oh, everything is fine. But I'm optimistic because, I still think I'm a young man. In my lifetime, I've seen a lot of change. We don't go after the old growth like I used to do when I was a forester younger. We've learned a lot in my profession. I see a lot of other professions that have really fundamentally transformed. And I believe that we're making tremendous progress socially as well as ecologically, even though the challenges keep heaping upon us, and it makes the seriousness of our work even more critical. And this resilience issue. We are very adaptive. So we'll do something else. I don't want it to be so extreme that we've got to hope that the cockroaches eventually evolve to play Mozart. But I would hope that it would be something that we are able to move in a direction that does not create additional destruction or violence or loss.
Thanks, Jim. Anyone else?
Thanks, Jim. That was terrific. Didn't he do a great job? I love your passion. Since you talked a bunch about genetic resources, and I was thinking as you had that chart up there about the different property regimes, that in the case of the open access sort of non-property, sort of free-for-all of go out and capture it, one of the real challenges that I'm concerned about is the ways in which global capital, if you will go after some of these genetic resources in the global south, and that are essentially have always been open access, and then take them and bring them into our intellectual property regime, patent them, and then own them. And so I wonder if you could comment on that, or the ways in which some of these property regimes shift over time, too.
Sure. That's a great question, Eva. Thank you. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, this issue of the ownership of genetic material is very salient, particularly here in the United States, because we have really kind of a divided mind about this. At the 1992 Rio conference, that when the Earth Summit, it's been called, there was the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in 1993, then President Clinton signed the convention. But of course, it had to be ratified by the Senate, and it's never been ratified. But the United States remains an observer to the Convention on Biodiversity, which has a series of standards to be able to provide for the protection of genetic material and the ownership of that material for the benefit of the national population. And that's what we have not agreed to here in the United States, because we want that ownership to accrue to the developer of the genetic resources into a drug or whatever else might be made whole. Now, I tend to think that President Clinton was right in signing the convention because it allows countries to be able to mediate the exchange of genetic information. And in terms of, there's even a supplemental agreement about genetically modified organisms that I think you talked about a little bit, Neva. And the United States, by not ratifying the convention, is kind of the odd man out. We go to these international conferences and we kind of sit there as observers and we have a lot of influence, but we really aren't actually moving the ball down the court. I think we have to ratify this convention. I think we need to move forward in its management. This is a brave new world that I don't know very much about. But having some kind of international standards around its use and its distribution, I think only helps to serve all of us. It kind of takes it and makes it a common resource that we're going to be able to use and manage instead of taking it for the benefit of a few. So that's a great question and a very inadequate answer. But I would really hope that you can look up the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's a lot of interesting literature on this. And I think it's something that we as a citizenry can really advocate for.
Anyone else? Oh, great.
Jim, can I tap your optimism one more time? The thing I want to know about is, at a political level, if you're a life scientist, you worry that we live in a country where a tiny percentage of our population only believes in evolution, which is how we understand all living things are interrelated.
Right.
And a very small percentage of the population actually believes that there's a climate issue to be dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
So, given your optimism, can you say anything about how to look at it at that level? Because I think a lot will be determined by how it plays out at that level.
Sure. I think that we mistakenly think that, the future has to be now, that there isn't a continuum for us to be able to change. We weren't talking about climate change really 20 years ago, and we really talk a lot about it now. Unfortunately, we see the repercussions of inaction and the kinds of things that are happening, so there is a sense of urgency. But I think that this issue of learning is something that's very important. As time goes on and we keep getting information, it becomes almost overwhelming. But there's also other ways to deal with it. I once heard a really interesting kind of approach from another scientist to, if you're engaging with someone who is doubting whether or not that humans have any interaction with the effect on the climate, to say, well, let's discard whether that's true or not. And just let's look at it from a point of view of a risk analysis. Let's assume for a moment that you're right, that the climate denier, that in fact humans don't have anything to do with this, it's just cyclic, and all these scientists, they just missed the boat. And what would be the outcome? Well, the outcome, if we believed all the scientists and started riding our bicycles and using reusable water bottles and had to keep our air conditioners not so cold, it'd be pretty inconvenient. It just 50 years from now, we'd go, God, I could have had that big honking pickup truck. Now let's assume the other risk analysis. What happens if actually the scientists are right and we adopt your position of drill, baby, drill? Who cares what goes on? What are the consequences of that set of kind of conditions? What will be the outcome? And the outcome will be very hard. The outcome is global sea rise and displacement of maybe 1 billion people and hunger and war and terrifically terrible things that our grandchildren will curse our names. So maybe just from the point of view of risk analysis, what risk do you want to take to be inconvenienced or to be put in very troublesome kinds of futures? So I thought that was an interesting way to approach it. It's not original. It's something that I've never tried that before with a climate denier. They might go, oh, yeah, right. But I honestly believe that as time goes on, as we continue to observe things, there's something about learning that is really powerful, especially when it's interactive, especially when it's observational. And I think Glacier Park is one of our great examples of, taking people out there and kind of, where's the glaciers? Even though there's much propaganda and much kind of misinformation that's out there, eventually you know, as my mother would say, the liar is exposed. And, you know, we'll have that realization of what is really going on. So I guess to be optimistic, I remember my mom.
Anyone else?
Yes, Royce.
Oh, we've got one more. Royce, oh, I'm sorry, Royce. Go ahead.
Oh, we live on the water planet, and the oceans are so essential, yet they're international. And it seems to me it's very difficult to address that very important problem.
I agree. I really don't have a good answer. I'm not terribly familiar with the law of the sea and the international negotiations that go on there. I know there's been big efforts to be able to modernize and think carefully about the distribution of access to fisheries and the use of the oceans. Undersea drilling is going to be a major issue. But I know that a lot of people are paying attention to that, and we have to make much more progress, much more quickly. That's a great question. The oceans are life. The oceans are just, you know, incredibly important to us, and the more attention we can pay to the kind of changing of how it is that we organize and manage them, the better off we're going to be.
Jim, I like to share your optimism, and I really enjoy the way you ended your talk. But what makes you think that that generation will make wiser decisions than our generation has made? Or how do we help ensure that they do make wiser decisions than we made?
Sure. There's a couple of things. I think access to information for this generation is extraordinarily better than access to information in my generation. I think that they can check on things. I was afraid that one of my friends also sitting there in the front row was going to use his smartphone, and whoa, you know, that wasn't quite right. And people are able to do that. So they've got tools that are just truly remarkable. Second, I think that in many respects, the world has grown smaller now than at any time in human history. I really want to congratulate you for this effort to have our students go overseas. Guatemala, that experience changed my life. And when we're making opportunities for students to get that other perspective that they wouldn't have had before. And we see kind of this internationalization of young people as I think a very positive step. And finally, all I have to do is look at my kids and see them roll their eyes whenever I say anything, and I realize, you know, it doesn't make any difference if they're smarter than me or not. They think they're smarter, and that's probably all you need.
Yes, here's another question.
I sense a contradiction that I might walk out of the room with. You stated there were how many millions of hectares of forest being removed from the ecosystem annually? 12 million?
Something like that, yeah, about
Something
12
like that, and
Yeah.
the world's population continues to increase. A living tree takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. If you cut it down and you make a podium out of it, or a house like I live in, it's a wood house, that carbon doesn't go into the atmosphere. But that tree no longer withdraws that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So as the total mass of living trees decreases, the total ability of the planet to remove carbon dioxide goes down. That's a contradiction.
Thank you for that. Indeed, you're correct. If we convert the forest, in other words, take it out of plant production and, you know, make it pavement or urbanize it, or convert it to another use that isn't photosynthesizing and capturing that carbon, you're absolutely right. We have that net loss. But by using the wood in a way that allows that same area where the tree was cut to grow back and have a new forest, that new forest will start to photosynthesize again. And eventually you'll get a net gain as long as you don't convert that to a non-plant, you know, covered area. And that's a very real problem because we do convert a lot of areas to other kinds of uses. So thank you for that.
why don't we thank Jim again for his presentation tonight and head down the hallway to the Wine and Cheese, and he'll be there, and you're welcome to ask him more questions there. Thanks, everyone.